Okay. Okay, good morning, everybody. We are doing chapter 30, which is, whoa, this chapter is such a lesson for life. It's an amazing, amazing, amazing parak of Tanya. Um, it continues the theme. It continues the theme which we started speaking about last week about a plugged heart, Timtum Halev, but from a completely different angle of how to resolve this plugged heart. So last chapter, the Alter Rebbe spoke about becoming broken-hearted in order to solve this plugged heart, right? We gave the example of the log that you cut up in like small little pieces. In other words, the technique was not to increase the light, but to make the heart more receptive to the light of the divine soul. And also, one of the ways to do this was to become brokenhearted about the condition of your animal soul by raging at the Yetzer Hara. And actually, when one rages at the Yetzer Hara, you kind of like separate yourself from the Yetzer Hara because you're looking at the Yetzer Hara separate to yourself. It's as if it's a separate being and you're raging at it, right? So that was last chapter. This chapter discusses another angle. The Alter Rebbe discusses another angle and another tactic of humbling oneself, because apparently humbling oneself is what breaks the heart open to receiving the light, like cracks the heart open to receiving the light. And the Alter Rebbe brings the saying from Pirkei Avos, actually, which is that a person should humble himself before every other person. The language is v'have shafel ruach b'fnei kol ha'adam. You should become humble in front of every person. Now, why, first of all, why humility? Because the Timtum Halev occurs as a result of the Beinoni feeling superior and arrogant. And arrogance causes a plugged heart. So the antidote to this arrogance is this suggestion that the Alter Rebbe gives us to become humble oneself before everybody. Now, what does it mean to become humble before everybody? And this is what this chapter is going to discuss. Because the Alter Rebbe says, if we are talking about feeling humble in front of everyone, that includes even sinners. That includes you thinking and you knowing and you believing that you may even be lower than a person called Kal Shebakalim, a sinner who does the worst sins. He's the Kal Shebakalim. He doesn't just do one little sin here and there. He like is a complete sinner. So one should feel humble according to this and lower even than a Kal Shebakalim. So how do we actually do this and why should we do this, right? So the Alter Rebbe says you can do this, and he will explain why should we do this by learning about judging another person. And that is why I think this chapter is so beautiful. It teaches us how to let go of judgment. The Mishnah states, Al tadin es chaverei ad shetagia limkoimei. Do not judge your fellow until you are in his place. That is what the Alter Rebbe, that's the pasuk that the Alter Rebbe brings. Now, why are we so worried about his place? Why can we not be told, Al tadin es chaverei, don't judge your fellow? Why can we not just not judge our fellow? Why do we have to know about his place? Don't judge your fellow until you reach his place, because his place contributes to his sin. So let's explain this. His place can be both physical and spiritual. So physically, perhaps the sinner's workplace is in the street, and he sees all sorts of temptations, as opposed to one who sits at home all day and is sheltered. right? So he's exposed to temptation. And the result is that when a person is exposed to temptation and not sheltered, a person's Yetzer Hara is kindled and excited and burns like an oven, says the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is usually passionate, but now when it's exposed to temptation, it's even more so. By the way, that's why, for example, if you're trying to eat healthy and you just don't buy the unhealthy food, you're more likely to be successful than if you have it staring at you in the face in your closet, right? Because once the Yetzer Hara sees the temptation, the Yetzer Hara is even more passionate. So Mekaimai in this regard, physically, is that his place is a place of temptation. But Mekaimai also refers to his spiritual place. Spiritually, maybe he is in the streets all day long, but his Yetzer Hara is not so strong. He doesn't have such a strong Yetzer Hara, because just as there are different types of animals, there are different types of Yetzer Haras and animal souls. So you can have a wild animal, a tame animal, a bull, a lamb, passive animal, aggressive, angry, passionate. Not all people have the same reaction to temptation or to the stimulant. And therefore we take into account Mekaimai, his spiritual reaction, his spiritual type of temptation, meaning that it is relative immorality. In other words, we ask ourselves, how would we behave, if you don't want to judge another person, how would we behave if we were exposed to his problems and his temptations? And that's how you basically, and we're going to go more into detail, how you judge a person. Sorry, I'm just going to sneeze. How you judge a person according to their place by asking yourself, because your Yetzer Hara and his Yetzer Hara might not be the same, by asking yourself these questions. Do I have a similar workplace or conditions, physical condition as him? And what's my spiritual level compared to him? Do I have the same kind of Yetzer Hara as him? Is my Yetzer Hara different? Is my Yetzer Hara more tame? Is my Yetzer Hara more passionate? But the Alter Rebbe is going to get even more detailed soon. The Alter Rebbe does make a note at this point in the perek that not judging a person is definitely not a justification for a person to sin. We're not justifying the sin that a sinner commits. And the person who sins is still a rasha because he is lacking a fear of Hashem, which keeps him from sinning. If a person has a fear of Hashem, that prevents you from sinning. And he does not conduct himself in a way of mayach shalit alalev, of mind over heart. However, and this is interesting, the way a person behaves, says the Alter Rebbe, is between him and Hashem. And when we judge another person, we have to take into account his place, his mekaymai, his physical and spiritual place. The rest is between him and Hashem. We cannot simply say, he sins and I don't. Wow, I'm so superior, right? But one should first question, if I were in his situation, if I were in his matzav, what would I do? It's very easy to judge another person and say, why is this other person sinning? But if I was in that physical and spiritual place, what would I do? But how can we actually measure this? Asks the Alter Rebbe. We can measure this, and this is so beautiful, by using a comparative struggle that we have ourselves. When we use a comparative struggle, and we will explain in a minute what is a comparative struggle. When we use a comparative struggle, we will realize that we are indeed the same and possibly even lower than a sinner. Now, what is a comparative struggle? Which will bring us down a couple of notches and keep us from helping us let go of judgment, right? So when a person sins, they're sinning in the area of bad, evil, right? And we are told, sur meira, keep from evil. So what's a comparative struggle? A comparative struggle would be in the area of asay tov, of positive actions. So the question to ask yourself is, do I put in the same amount of effort? Do I have the same struggle to do a mitzvah as I expect the sinner to have to not sin, to not give into his temptations? Do I put in the same amount of effort and struggle in asay tov? And the main example that the Alter Rebbe brings is davening. Why davening? Because davening is 3 times a day, so it's almost a constant. And therefore it's similar to the person who battles his Yetzer Hara all day long. One can ask oneself, do I have kavana? What is my kavana like? Am I able to have the proper kavana at all times? With the proper strength? Do I bare my soul to Hashem when I daven? Am I transparent to Hashem? And the Alter Rebbe says we're not even talking about Kabbalistic intentions, just regular kavana. Am I as enthusiastic about davening as I want him to be to withstand his temptations? The davening with kavana, says the Alter Rebbe, is a similar struggle because the animal soul interferes and prevents a person from having kavana because the body is lazy and the body seeks rest and inactivity. And we have to reduce this resistance 3 times a day, at least for men. Women are only twice. It's a similar battlefield, both in intensity, quantity, and consistency of the battle, right? So a person who's always faced with temptation struggles to not to sin. So the question to ask ourselves, oh, what about me? What about my struggle 3 times a day? Do I win that battle? Do I daven so enthusiastically? Do I have kavana? Do I win that battle of the animal soul consistently, intensely, always? Because we don't judge accomplishment, and this is very, very big chiddush of the Alter Rebbe, that we don't judge accomplishment, but we judge effort and sacrifice in the service of God. And Hashem himself, that's how he judges. He doesn't judge results because Hashem knows your circumstances. So that's why the victory is in the battle. The struggle is what's important, not the result. What we expect from the lowest of the low, that we should overcome temptations both externally in our surroundings and internally from the Yetzer Hara. We ask ourselves, do we do that as well in the area of Asay Tov? We ask ourselves, am I capable of this kind of effort and struggle? And you figure out the answer by examining areas of your life where you struggle. And the Alter Rebbe says, someone who does not struggle, someone who does not have this level of struggle, maybe it's very easy for you to daven. Maybe it's easy for you to do mitzvahs. If you don't, there are some people that are very disciplined by nature, right? If you don't have that struggle with your body in order to daven properly or perform mitzvahs, you have not reached the same category of struggle as one who struggles against his Yetzer Hara, and therefore there's no way for you to judge because you don't have the same struggle. You can only judge a person by having similar struggle. So that's why we say Ezehu Gibor HaKovesh Es Yitzroi. Who is strong? Someone who overcomes his Yetzer Hara, his temptations. It's easy to overcome somebody else's struggles, but one who is really strong is one who overcomes his own struggles, doesn't look at somebody else's struggles. Other examples that the Alter Rebbe brings are, that we could use to our comparative struggle of judgment, right, are brachas for food, benching after food, kavana in all the mitzvahs, giving tzedakah, Is it easy for me to give tzedakah? Do I give as much tzedakah as I should? Am I increasing in my tzedakah as much as I want? Am I putting in as much effort as I want the sinner to put in to his avodas Hashem, right? Torah study. Am I studying more than what is my nature or is habitual for me? Because that's when we're really considered serving Hashem, right? Now, one question that the Alter Rebbe does raise is, one second, isn't sinning worse than not doing a mitzvah? Like, how can we actually compare the two? So it's an interesting question. In other words, the question is, sinning seemingly it seems worse than omitting a mitzvah. In other words, isn't sur meira worse than like not doing the asay tov, right? But the Alter Rebbe answers that first of all, both sur meira and asay tov are the will of Hashem. And although he doesn't say it in this chapter, later on in Igeres HaTshuva, in the very first chapter of Igeres HaTshuva, we see that the tshuva for omitting a sin is somewhat more difficult than the tshuva that a person does for actually sinning, because omitting a mitzvah, a sin of omission versus a sin of commission, is really a lost opportunity that you cannot get back.
No, I was watching
Whereas,
something else.
whereas a sin of commission, you can always do tshuva and transform the past as well. So, if a person will truly examine himself, he will realize that not only actually in Asay Tov, because up till now the Alter Rebbe is saying, okay, so compare yourself and ask yourself in areas of mitzvahs, are you also putting in the same amount of enthusiasm and struggling in the same way and of that you expect from the sinner? But even if you really, really examine yourself, you will also realize that even in the areas of sur meira, of sinning, you are not perfect in your avoidance of evil, even if it is subtle. Because remember that the Alter Rebbe is speaking to the level of a Beinoni. We are all potential Beinonis, but the level of a Beinoni, there is no sinning involved, right? But what does that mean that even in sur meira, your avoidance of evil is subtle? And the Alter Rebbe gives a few examples. One example he gives is that you won't interrupt a pleasant conversation of gossip, which is not even technically Lashon Hara, but would be a slight slur to his friend. And even you might even engage in a subtle slight to somebody in order to exonerate yourself. And he brings the example of Rabbi Shimon, a Tana in the Gemara, who told his father about an erroneous divorce document that had a mistake in it, that he wanted to exonerate himself, that it wasn't him that prepared the document, and he said that Yehuda the tailor wrote it. And he said this simply to exonerate himself, and his father, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, replied to keep away from slander. So even a very slight sin, if a person really examines themselves, they will realize that they are sinning as well. But mainly the focus on this chapter is about using a comparative struggle in the area of Asay Tov to compare yourself to the sinner. I just want to point out, now the Alter Rebbe does not say this, but I actually gave a workshop recently in the Kinnis, and I used this chapter of Tanya to help us in not judging people in our own family who struggle. Because the truth of the matter is that we tend to judge people who are nearest and dearest to us more often than we judge other people. We don't really care. We're not emotionally involved in other people's sins or lack thereof, right? So it's important to keep in mind this parak of Tanya when it comes to people who are close to us, family members, relatives, members of our community. It's easy to judge, but then we can turn it around. We can let go of judgment by remembering this comparative struggle that the Alter Rebbe tells us, and it humbles us. It humbles us and it unplugs our heart to be receptive to the light of the Nefesh Elokis. The other examples also that the Alter Rebbe brings that shows a person that he's become a little insensitive to slightly sinning in a very subtle way. There is a mitzvah of sanctifying yourself with that is permitted. Kadesh atzmecha b'mutar lach. In other words, there are sins and there are mitzvahs, and then is the area of permissible activities. So you can think that, okay, look, I'm not a tzaddik. I eat, I sleep, work to have parnasa in the areas of klipas noiga, really, neutral activities. I don't have to be a tzaddik, but the truth is there is actually a mitzvah to elevate those areas of our lives to kedusha. So if we're not actively doing that, we are the same level of the kal shabakalim, who we expect to put in so much effort into his struggle against the temptations of the Yetzer Hara, whether it's because of his type of Yetzer Hara or because of his circumstances and physical place. We have actually become insensitive. And then the Alter Rebbe says something, wow, because he says, not only are you no better than a kal shabakalim, a sinner, but you may even be worse. You know why? Because you are a person who learns Torah, and you should know better. You have more knowledge. Sinners are sometimes not as aware of the gravity of their sins as the people judging them. And all of this whole entire chapter is to reflect upon another tool to break the complacency of the heart in order to be responsive to Hashem and godly matters. So in actual fact, the letting go of judgment is a tool to make us more sensitive to godliness. It is also a way for us to let go of judgment, right? But in the end, letting go of judgment is to our benefit, because then we become more sensitive to Elikus, we become more sensitive to the godly soul, and we don't have Timtum Halev anymore. And then we are able to serve Hashem with the appropriate emotions of love and fear. So it's a beautiful chapter. Anyone have any questions or observations? Yep. Hi, Sarah.
So I actually love what we learned today. I'm thinking when someone does a sin against you, and you can look in your heart and you can see the things that you're doing wrong, but how do you get to the place? I know it's between him and God, but how do you get to the place of just not judging when you've been injured?
That's an amazing question. That is an amazing question. I don't know necessarily that the Alter Rebbe is speaking over here regarding someone sinning against you per se, but I will answer it, because the purpose of this parak is for you to unplug your heart, and one of the ways is to stop judging sinners in general, right? To realize that you may be even as low as or even worse than a sinner. But to let go of judgment of another person is an avodah, and one of the ways that the Alter Rebbe brings in different places of Tanya, right, of letting go of judgment, is by realizing that everything is hashgacha pratis, and that the person himself is merely a messenger from Hashem, delivering this blow to you. That does not mean that you have to become shmata and accept whatever anyone wants to mete out, right? You can definitely put up boundaries and not accept that kind of behavior against you because it is wrong, right? Even in this chapter, the Alter Rebbe says we're not justifying sinning. It's wrong. A person who sins is a rasha. But this is a way for you to realize that it's from Hashem. Nothing goes on in this world without coming from Hashem. That is one way. The other way is also the opposite of judgment is compassion. So if you can arouse, not always is it possible, but if you can arouse some modicum of compassion for the other person, a justification why he would behave the way he is, then that also helps to let go of judgment as well.
Okay, thank you.
It's about changing the story that we tell ourselves about the other person.
I have a comment, Kana.
Yeah.
it sounds like, when we judge somebody, we only see what we see, right? Like, oh, why don't they do it this way? Or why don't they do it that way? But when we put ourselves in the other person's shoes, then, and we experience something similar, that's when really they can be seen, right? So we only can judge somebody if we're basically in their same situation, but even we can't judge them, we can just relate to them, right? We can never judge somebody because even if we went through the exact same situation, I'm me and they're them, right? So it's still different because it's a different person. Everyone relates differently.
So the Alter Rebbe says in this chapter you don't need to have the exact situation. You can use a comparative
Yeah,
situation, which is the Asay Tov. But you're right. And if you don't have a comparative struggle, then you really can't judge them.
right. I'm just trying to think about in terms of like, people say like I feel seen, you know, um,
Yeah,
and it's
yeah,
like
that's important.
right?
It is. It is important.
Yeah. Okay, good.
When you
But
validate another person's struggle, they do feel seen.
yeah,
Not condoning the sin, right? You have to separate condoning of the action versus um, validating the struggle
right,
because you have found within yourself that you struggle similarly, could be in something completely different, but you have a comparative struggle. You know what struggle means. Everybody knows what struggles, and we forget that. That's why this chapter of Tanya is so powerful, so powerful. And by the way, this applies to everybody. It applies to our husbands, applies to our children, applies to our Mikuravim, applies to our family members, applies to our cousins and grandparents and whoever else, applies to
right. We
every
could,
single person.
right, we could,
V'hevei ruach b'fnei kol adam.
right. I think we could say, I don't agree with what you did, but I understand how or why you got there and what caused you to react this way.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, very good.
I can see the work that you do, um, making you feel judging yourself, right? Like, oh my gosh, what have I? Then you'd have to use other chapters of Tanya to get out of the depression of actually
Yeah.
judging yourself. So,
Yeah, well, that's a good point you make, hi, Sarah, because here you go, Alter doesn't discuss judging yourself, but he actually encourages you in this chapter to
right.
judge yourself, which is why it's a very important distinction that you just made. We have to remember that we don't always have to judge ourselves. It's when it's
Mhm.
needed that we have to judge ourselves. Alter Rebbe mentions many, many times in Tanya to do it at an appropriate time. So if you're falling into judging yourself randomly during the day, well, that's our little Yetzer Hara at work, our big Yetzer Hara at work, actually. If it just comes up randomly, involuntarily, without intention, well, yes, that's not productive judging at all. And by the way, that's not to say that you can't feel compassion for yourself for your struggle, but you can just admit that yes, you also have a struggle. And poor me
Mhm.
and poor him, we have struggles. Poor all of us because the Yetzer Hara is so strong,
Very good.
Excellent.
right? Okay, anyone else before we sign off? Okay, so see you all next week. Amrit Hashem. Have a great week, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.